Hello, good morning. Great, our panel's taking shape. So welcome to this panel on the role of oil and gas companies. Are they keeping net zero aviation on the tarmac? So we're really vying to be one of the most lively and maybe the most controversial panels of the conference. I'm Emily Hickson. I am Director of European Programmes at an environmental NGO called Climate Catalyst. So we work on heavy emitting industry topics like aviation, but also steel and chemicals. And we're really focused on driving down emissions in those sectors. And in aviation, we have worked for about a year on how we're going to drive down emissions in aviation, which of course the answer is SAF. That's why we're all here today, and particularly our focus has been on synthetic fuels. And actually it was being at SAF Investor last year in London that led to the genesis of this panel, because as we were discussing again and again the risks of getting these plants off the ground and reaching FID, we looked around and we thought it odd that the incumbent fuel suppliers, the biggest fuel suppliers today at our airports in the UK and Europe, weren't at this conference. And actually, again, if I've looked at the attendee list right, they are also not here at this conference. You can shout at me during the Q&A if you are here and want to represent that industry. But so our interest in this topic was born, and of course it has already come up in some of the comments that were on the previous panel today. So I've got a brilliant panel here of researchers, of financiers, of airports, and we're really going to discuss why we think this is happening and what you all, who represent the investor or lending communities, perhaps could lean into doing something about it. So we'll go through that. If we just put up the next slide, just to highlight that my organisation, Climate Catalyst, has written a kind of overview briefing on this topic, which you can download from this QR code. And actually, we think this topic is so important that it requires discussing twice at this conference. So tomorrow morning, we're doing a private roundtable before the plenary starts. So if you're interested in attending that, particularly if you're an investor or lender, please come talk to me. We've got an excellent range of participants coming to that already. So, without further ado, I'm going to kick off our panel. Oh, I must say, we're going to have at least 10 minutes of Q&A at the end, so let's really get into that debate, particularly if you disagree with the kind of premise of this panel. And we have Slido open as well, so please get your questions in there. We'll leave time for that. So, I'm going to kick us off by turning to Dana. From Investory Flying. So I also met Dana at last year's SAF Investor, and I think we sat down and we said, why aren't the incumbent fuel suppliers, one seeing the mandate, why aren't they here? Why aren't we seeing more action? So I'm really pleased that then she, over the last year, has produced some breathtaking analysis on really kind of making the case that the cost of inaction is so much greater than the cost of action. So Dana, can I ask you to take us through your analysis and what you found when you were doing that?
Absolutely. Hi, hello everyone. So, okay, this works great. So as you said, I basically in the past years were really wondering. You know, everyone's talking about SAF and the cost of SAF and the implication of blending SAF into the mix and, you know, what the mandates represent and how we're going to deal with the increased cost of fuel as those mandates increase. But what I really wanted to know is what would be the effect of not blending SAF and not having SAF in the mix, especially within an EU context where we have the mandates, we have the penalties, but also we have the ETS, which tends to kind of be left, you know, outside of this discussion. So what you see here is the results of a summary of the results of the model that I've produced. Just a few assumptions from the model just so you can understand what this all represents. So this uses the latest EASA SAF cost estimation from the report that they released 2 months ago. We're looking at an evolution in the price of production of SAF going down by about 30% in 30 and 45% in 2035, which is very ambitious, but why not? And then looking at an ETS price of about 120 today, up to 200 euros per ton of CO2 in 2035. Now, just a quick reminder for those that forgot, 1 ton of jet fuel is about 3 tons of CO2. So for each ton of fuel, of Jet A, that we are burning in an aircraft, the airline has to pay 3 tons of CO2 to the ETS, so anywhere between 360 to 600 euros in addition. Now, when we look at that, and we look at 4 different scenarios, so these 4 scenarios, scenario 1 is no SAF in the blend, just Jet A. Scenario 2 is looking at today's SAF capacity and assuming an increase of 50% in that capacity every 5 years. Scenario 3 looks at the scenario that Alistair talked about earlier, so doubling capacity every 5 years. And scenario 4 looks at full compliance with the mandate. So doubling capacity with today's, so doubling capacity every 2 years based on today's capacity is not enough to fulfill the mandate. And what we see is, if we look at 2035, and I have my notes here, so forgive me if I'm looking down. In 2035, the cost of inaction represents an increase of almost 300% in the cost of fuel for an airline. 300%. Now let's talk about partial compliance. Partial compliance, we're looking at scenario 2 and 3. The difference is not big between increasing production by 50% every 5 years or doubling production every 5 years, because the penalties take the hand. However, out of 130% or 125%, 69% of that additional cost is ETS, is carbon taxation. So the majority of the increase in price is not the penalties, and it's not SAF. SAF, if I may, in scenario 2 and 3, represent 6% of additional cost. That is what the cost of blending SAF is, 6% increase in fuel. 70% is ETS. And then when we fully comply, that goes to 60% ETS and 35% SAF without penalty. But it shows really that what happens is that blending SAF and fulfilling the mandate is really the most cost-effective way of doing that. Now, I realize I'm going on, so I'm going to be quick with a comparison of what that means for the fuel suppliers, the oil and gas companies. What are those risks that they're basically taking? And that is market relevance, right? If I am an airline and I have the choice of 4 suppliers, right? Sorry, again, I can't see. Supplier 1 has no SAF. Supplier 2 has 50% blended SAF, 50% of the mandate. Supplier 3 fulfills the mandate, and supplier 4 is over-blending, so more than 100% of the mandate. For me as an airline, if you look at on the right-hand side, the cost of fulfilling half the mandate or over-blending is the same. So if I'm an airline and I have the choice of 4 suppliers, some of them choose to do nothing or a little bit, and some choose to overdo, I would much rather go with the one that overblends, because for me the cost is the same, and I'm actually decarbonizing. And so, unfortunately, they're not here, but maybe if they saw these numbers, the numbers will talk and convey the message.
They certainly talk to me. Thank you. I think really what stands out there is also the impact of kind of minimal compliance. I mean, it offers very little cost protection, and just the risk that you're bringing out there. I mean, we talked earlier about that kind of lots of different risks and revenue certainty risks. When prices go that high, the revenue certainty on kerosene looks dicey, and that's what we want to kind of bring out now. So I'm going to go to Ulrike Ulrike Ziegler from Impact for Sustainable Aviation, who is our kind of financier on the panel, so to speak. And no doubt you know her because she represents, or her members are over 30 banks, leases, and other financial actors who are all committed to help align with net zero goals. And I know Ulrike from the very start has been really laser focused on a critical truth that capital allocation is going to shape climate outcomes here. So Ulrike, I'm just going to ask you to kind of first kind of reflect a little bit on Dana's research findings and ask you kind of how do you think investors have been assessing the transition strategies of the incumbent fuel suppliers?
Thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Firstly, thanks to Dana for finally putting these numbers together, because what I've seen over the last 3 years since Impact has been around, it's always narrative. It's going to be way too expensive and we can't put that burden on the passenger, and that's where our whole kind of narrative stops. And I think we truly need to own the narrative and own a solution for that. And I think it's extremely helpful looking holistically at that. And if, and I guess people looking at the numbers will have to wake up to reality. It's time to move forward. In terms of how do investors assess the climate strategy of fuel suppliers, I guess it depends on what kind of investors you have, right? I mean, do they have a long-term, a short-term view? I've talked to investors who say, listen, I invest, my horizon is 2 to 3 years. I can't be bothered about sustainability. I mean, those who are in the game long-term, I guess will have to take account of any risk associated to not transitioning. It's about where the investor is based. You've seen people pull out in the US from, sustainability investments due to the current political climate, but also the background. And I guess, if you had a pension fund who has fiduciary duty to actually keep the investments alive and ideally, increase the returns on that, they will look at it differently. But I really question to what extent investors can actually assess where oil majors stand. Because like in many things, aviation, it's not also transparent. I mean, do we see very clear transition path and actionable points behind that? I question that. So it goes back to transparency. And I think it should be up also to the investors to ask for substantiation of the risk of not transitioning. Again, that is something that's, hardly ever mentioned, but it can really wipe out substantial values, can actually cause massive write-offs, which will actually affect the creditworthiness of the oil majors, make it very difficult to attract more capital. That needs to be borne in mind, and I have a number here saying, the current valuation of oil majors, if we were looking at a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming scenario, could be down by 60%, 60. And wouldn't you as an investor be interested in that one? But again, I think we need to be all out there and demand that there's clear information that allows us to actually do a proper assessment on the situation.
Yeah, thank you, absolutely. And I guess and for those longer term investors that you mentioned, say a pension fund who will be around in 2035 in a carbon constrained world with an ETS functioning, with penalties functioning, I mean, what should they be looking at today, do you think, or demand or asking for today in order to make a distinction between genuine challenges, of which there are many, and that was the first panel today, or lack of pace and action? I mean, is it transparency, as you were saying? Is that where lenders and investors probably need more transparency on information to make those assessments, or is there anything they could really ask for today?
I guess it starts with transparency and what you want to see as an investor, what you command, look at how the company has developed, where has the capex shifted? Is it still stuck with the core business they're doing, or whether it's going into transitioning? It's about also, where's the company going in their ambition to absolute emissions reductions? And we see that also in aviation, airlines, lessors, and we talk about intensity, a great metric, but that doesn't translate into absolute emissions reductions. That's a very core issue. It's about, to what extent, looking behind the scenes, is the executive compensation tied to transition risks or avoiding such transition risks? I don't see that happening an awful lot. And it's also, to what extent do these majors deliver on projects rather than just announcement. Do we see real progress? And I guess that's a very fair point to say, but it's not out there yet. I guess the majority of information is still very opaque, to put it nicely, and we need to put out there more often. Yes, there are challenges, like with any other investor. It's the policy hurdles, it's permission issues. So it's not all that black and white that they can change the scene overnight. And I would think a clearly red flag that an investor should have is if there's an over-reliance, for example, in offsets. So we're looking at a cheap solution, right? You buy nature-based offsets, for example, rather than saying, I put some money to work. It's very critical. And finally, I guess, we need to have, capital allocation that's going into renewable energy, into SAF. We need clear transition plans. We need to demand that. And I guess we also need to look at the board composition to make sure it stacks up. If it's just the usual suspects that have never been committed to the cause, I guess we need to see some fresh blood with, people that have a true, I wouldn't say inspiration, but a true assessment of risk and looking to the future. Again, with actions today, we're going to chart the future tomorrow.
Excellent. So that was a really good list of recommendations, actually, that maybe my organisation put into a cheat sheet, because you just said exactly what to look at, and particularly capital allocation, particularly project completion. Also, it was very interesting to hear earlier about some of the oil majors investing in heifer projects in China, and I think there could be some scepticism of how much of that fuel is going to be compliant with standards in the UK, with the heifer cap, and even standards in the EU. So how much of that is really getting us on course to net zero aviation, at least. So I'd love to go to Neil Robinson next from Manchester Airport Group. And you also represent Sustainable Aviation, which is a kind of UK group of airlines, airports, aerospace manufacturers that represent 90%, I think, of the UK aviation system. And Neil, you're joining. We're at a pivotal moment, I would say, because groups like yours, who represent a large swathe of the industry, have in large part set targets. You set out your roadmap. We're also seeing the UK government come forward with the SAF mandate, the RCM, which of course will be early 2026. So we do seem to have got to a point where the industry is kind of coming forward. Government has done what, or is doing what they can say they are doing what they said they would do. You can always ask for more. But we've seen underwhelming, I think, progress from kerosene fuel suppliers. So I'm interested to hear from you, given your members are so reliant on their fuel suppliers in order to meet their targets, what more do you think can be done so that Sustainable Aviation, can be on that roadmap to net zero?
Thank you. Big question. I wonder if you might just indulge me with a minute of sort of context, really. I think what Dana provides is a really elegant analysis to show that it's the most economically rational way to decarbonise with SAF. That's very good. I think actually the choice is probably simpler, clearer, and a little bit more stark than that. There is no plausible alternative for aviation. And actually, the idea that we might have a strategy where we choose not to decarbonise but buy out would just simply leave aviation as such a special case that it's likely to merit special treatment in policy. So we're absolutely not there. So what we can do as an industry is very much what we have done, which is signal very strong, unified commitment to this, and you'll see that universally across the whole of the sustainable aviation family, particularly the airlines who are the principal customers. And what we've also spent a period of time doing is trying to understand what's necessary to give the right framework to allow this industry to nurture and grow. And we've made an awful lot of progress, haven't we? We've seen the government support through capital grants. We understood that the key concerns are about the strength of the market. Well, we now have a regulated market with a mandate. We understood there was a lot of concern about sale price and revenues. We're heading in the UK to a revenue certainty mechanism that's government underwritten. So I'd like to think that our members, as part of that industry public policy partnership, have helped to create what is a really strong framework and climate now to enable this industry to go forward. So what more can we do? I suppose, well, actually, we feel we've created the conditions, and I hope a conference like this can throw that question out a little bit more to the audience as to, well, what more do we need there, having created that climate, for those other stakeholders to step forward and really actively take a part? Because it has to be, at the end of the day, the oil majors are the only ones with the balance sheet and the technology to really grow this industry at scale.
Absolutely. Thanks, Neil. I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I'm going to go, last but not least, to Lorenzo Manca from Transport and Environment, really important NGO in Europe working on aviation. I noticed one of the speakers earlier was using your data, so you're pretty pivotal. And your background is sustainable finance, and you've worked in the Commission, actually. So, Lorenzo, I really just want to ask you a simple question. Why are we seeing a pattern of selective withdrawal from kind of third generation e-fuel, biofuel projects from the oil and gas industry? Because that's the headlines we've seen in the last year, withdrawal.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what we have seen as well. We have seen, for instance, last year Shell withdrawing from the project High Skies, which would have been a major e-fuels project in Sweden. And yeah, I mean, from what we saw also from Dana's presentation and also from our own research, because back in October we also calculated how much fuel suppliers will have to pay in penalties from Refuel EU in European Union, and also there is really not a case not to transition, because the price fuel suppliers will have to pay in terms of penalties, in terms of ETS, it's really so high that there is not really a point not to transition. And as Neil just said, that there is not really an alternative to SAF. So the reason why we see them probably withdrawing is also due to the political climate that has also been created in the European Union after the last elections, because we are seeing increasingly a lot of legislation that was passed even as late as 1 year ago that is now challenged by policymakers that are now withdrawing. They are now proposing to actually scrap some legislation, and that started. That started from climate reporting, for instance, last month. But we see that it's increasingly extending to many more sectors, and we expect the ETS review next year to be a very tough one. And potentially, we are not seeing yet a direct attack on Refuel EU, but I think that in this climate of withdrawal from the Green Deal, probably oil majors feel like it's the right moment to wait and see if actually there is a possibility to avoid the penalties altogether, and to avoid the SAF mandates altogether by scrapping or amending Refuel EU. So I think for now there is a wait-and-see approach from oil majors, just retaining their dominant position and waiting to see if there is a possibility to actually avoid the penalties and even some of the ETS consequences altogether.
Yes, wait and see seems adequate description of what's going on here, but an entirely unserious way of dealing with what, as we've just said, there's no plausible alternative. Aviation industry is going to be in a carbon-constrained world, and if it wants to exist, it's going to have to act. And you would thought that the basis, the ones that control the logistics and the current fuel supply, would want to be part of a 2030 aviation fuel supply chain. So I'm going to go back to Dana, and I'm just going to ask you, so based on the research you did, do you believe that oil and gas companies are underestimating their future carbon liability? And what should investors in this room be reading into that behavior?
I mean, absolutely underestimating, for sure. I think what really transpires from my research is, first of all, obviously, partial compliance is not enough, right? It offers marginal cost benefits. It's any cost benefit that is introduced by partial compliance is undone by the penalties that take place. But I think what we really have to understand is when there is only minimal compliance, so just fulfilling the mandates and really doing the bare minimum of what needs to be done, we are actually left exposed to the real the most volatile cost driver here, which is the ETS. Aviation is 4 to 5% of emissions, which means that we are leaving the rest of the 95% remaining emissions driven by every other industry that is part of the ETS to determine what is the cost of the carbon tax that we are going to pay. Refuel EU is not a stick. Refuel EU is an opportunity to take control over our own decarbonization journey. It's our way to say, okay, we are going to take over, we are going to take control, we are going to detach ourselves from every other industry's capacity to decarbonize. And I think this should really be the alarm for everyone in this room. I think and I said this last year, and I'm going to say it again, the EU will reach net zero by 2050, with or without aviation. I think we need to remember that, and I think we need to see the warning sign of what's next if Refuel EU is not fulfilled, and that is capping activity. We're seeing that in France today. There are routes that are being cancelled in France today to reduce aviation emissions. We have to use this opportunity to decarbonize faster than what is expected of us. And I think that requires collaboration and risk-taking from every single player in the value chain, whether it's producers, investors, airlines, oil majors, and of course, off-takers and the end consumer, which will want to keep flying. So they will be willing to pay that price.
And if I may add, I think, again, going back to my earlier point, we need to substantiate the risk, right? I mean, businesses are driven by money. And if people are aware, if investors are aware that there's a high risk of losing your investment, that's a kind of different story to be had. And I'm wondering, and I'm not an accountant, maybe there's someone in the audience or here in that panel. So looking at the mandates, and if a supplier cannot fulfill the mandate, doesn't want to fulfill the mandate, does the supplier have to put up a provision for that liability that's coming from a penalty? As far as I know, not, but that could be quite meaningful sums again. I think we need to have that holistic analysis next to what you've done. What could be the financial impact again on stranded assets, but also implications of these penalties or not meeting the mandates. I think that's something to be looked into.
Yeah, well, we can throw that question maybe out to the audience in a minute, see if people are looking at that liability, because you can see it coming in front of you, and it could be written into accounts now, and how we're scrutinising forward profits now. Ulrike, could I just ask you then, given all of this risk that we are stridently kind of saying is there, where do you see the strongest leverage for investors or lenders in the room right now? So what do we want them to be doing? Capital reallocation, of course, behind the scenes engagement, shareholder resolutions. What type of tools are in the toolbox to kind of change this forward trajectory?
Well, I'm a lawyer by background, so there is no black and white solution, I guess. And I guess you will have to look at it, as a phased approach. My personal preference is starting with behind-the-scene actions. Ultimately, it's about building trust. And if you have large investors that have, can establish a good rapport with their, with a company, I guess that's a different story. Building that narrative, building confidence that this action is required. Shareholder resolution, that certainly helps to put things more in the public domain, to build up pressure, to show to the average person in the street that something is being done. And I guess it creates a sense of accountability and puts some pressure on the company. At the same time, you need certain majorities to push things through. But I think that's another step. The last step, withdrawing money from the industry, I don't think it's going to work because you find other pockets of money who are just willing to fill that space. So I think that should be a very, very balanced approach if we think about withdrawing money. That should be the ultimate and final step. But again, for me it would be shareholder engagement behind the stage, and then shareholder resolutions followed by withdrawing of money. But I don't think it really helps. And also once that money is out, I think it will be very difficult, for that responsible and sensible money to go back into that, because the corporate memories are big.
Yeah, Neil, do you want to cover
I'm
that?
going to go back to your first answer as well. I think there must be something in transparency as well, that the direction of travel on net zero is obvious and clear. The EU will decarbonise. I take Dana's point. So all organisations really have to take a part in that and have to, with TCFD and other requirements, disclose what risks they're carrying. I think there's a real role for shareholders and investors to look closely at some of these organisations and see what role they're going to play as part of that journey overall, because we're all going to be impacted by it.
Absolutely. And yeah, Ulrike, thank you for that kind of different types of tools. And yeah, I agree with you that divestment is the very, very, very last stage resort, because the European aviation industry will be the most sustainable industry. It's the one that we want to lead the way. So we need money to stay here, but we need money to be invested in activities that are going to decarbonize it. And then, Neil, maybe I can just ask you just a bit to expand a bit more on what you were just saying, because, as I said earlier, the members of your group, Airports, Airlines, they also have investors that will be looking at this. But what's your message to the investors in this room who might have some relationships with those incumbent fuel suppliers? What specifically do we want them to do?
I think what just observer, I've worked with the Sustainable Aviation Coalition for quite a long time. We take in all of the major players, airlines, airports, manufacturers. On this issue, I've seen more consistency and more unified commitment than any other. So this industry is absolutely committed to developing SAF. So I think as an investor, I take that as a signal and the opportunity that comes from it, really. So what we're very keen to see is to work with partners, all of those different stakeholders, to give this industry scale. And you see actually people like airlines opting in quite unusual ways, stepping down the value chain, signing long-term agreements, really trying to pull through demand and send a really strong demand signal that we want stable, solid, consistent policy, and we're right behind things like the mandate.
Great. So maybe, Lorenzo, I'll just come to you, and then in a couple of minutes we'll start answering some of these Slido questions. But so we've talked about the policy environment, and it's moving in the right direction, but you could always say that more should be done. But I'm interested specifically in this kind of context that we don't want the aviation industry to be dragged, we want it to lead. To what extent can governments do more to, say, lean on or encourage oil and gas companies to do more in this space?
Well, let's say that before governments do more, they should actually do what they already have decided. Because, for instance, on penalties in RefuelEU in the European Union, almost all governments are late because they were supposed to actually put on paper the penalties that they would impose under RefuelEU by the end of last year. But we still see that they are all late, and even those that have actually implemented it in national law, they haven't really specified the amount of the penalties. So this is also something that allows oil companies to actually, not include the calculation of penalties in the balance sheets, because they can say they don't yet know what the amount of them. But so the very first thing government should do is actually complete RefuelEU and approve the penalties, so that oil companies can also see very clearly what non-compliance will cost.
Okay, and last quick fire question along the panel before we try and take some of these questions, and I try and read them in that small print over there, is what does a meaningful signal look like from an oil and gas company in this space? What should we demand, and by when?
I mean, from my end, is overblending. Do more than the mandates. Show that you want this to happen. I think it would really be the signal that would. I think from from an investment perspective as well. If an oil and gas company decides to uptake more than it has to, is a sign that there is demand and there is this desire to have more of this product available on the market.
And for me, it's kind of, they should manage their risk, right? If they start to manage their risk, they will, consider investing in these new fuels. Very simple.
That's my simple message, I guess. Capital allocation. This industry was, 1 million tons last year, 2 million tons this year, needs another 2 orders of magnitude. That's an awful lot of investment that's got to flow through. So serious and significant capital allocation.
But before we mention offtake agreements, would be a big leverage. So I think if a company was involved in offtake agreements, it would be already a strong signal from their side that they want to offer stuff in products.
Yeah, rollers off takers too. And I'd add to that, there's a significant role in kind of the role in distribution and storage at airports as well as the supplying at airports. So there's an enabling role that we would want to see. And I think that it came up on the panel this morning around those. Sometimes lenders are looking for kind of to build long-term relationships with those they like to lend to. They definitely would have long-term relationships with oil and gas companies. And so you can really capitalize on those partnerships and capitalize on those balance sheets, capitalize so that these companies can take a bit more risk than perhaps your small SAF supplier.
Sorry, Emily, if I may, right? And I do get it. I understand that only 8% of top line of oil majors is related to kerosene. So you could argue, is that really, really relevant? At the same time, I think there's such a great opportunity to build a narrative with still limited investments by supporting, having corporate venture departments that look at these smaller companies. And ultimately, if we're talking P2L e-fuels, that's all the smaller companies. They need another 5 million here, another 20 million there. So that can easily be done. I'm really wondering, there's this carrot out there, building that narrative and supporting these smaller companies, learning by doing that as well. They might not have all the expertise, but they have expertise in terms of technology, ground handling. When it comes to carbon capture, it's storage part they can do. And so just pull this, tie this together. And I think, that makes a case for investment.
So partnerships and a bit playing a role in the value chain. Okay, we're going to go to a couple of questions. They keep popping around. So I'm going to just take this middle one for the panel. Should new SAF technology developers proactively seek investment from oil majors, the obligated fuel suppliers, to help them get their projects off the ground? Any comments from the panel? Go on, Dana.
I think having an oil major at your table is already a big part of moving forward. Not necessarily from an investment point of view, even from an offtake point of view. If you have a fuel supplier that supports your project, supports your technology, and wants your product to be part of their blend, that should already be a great signal to moving forward.
Exactly, and I guess it helps the financing part. We talked about that, and we had the colleague from MUFG, right? It's very important who's behind a project, and it certainly adds quite some credibility to sell a deal.
Adds credibility, yeah. Sure. Okay, on to the next one. We'll just take this kind of the elephant in the room question. So do the panel think that the oil and gas industry is actually interested in achieving the policy mandates, or do they think they will go away?
Can I answer this question with a question? Have we confirmed if there's any of them in this room? I guess, yeah.
And that's part of the problem.
And I really wonder, I guess they'll be sitting on the side, which, many other industries will just do as well, and said, wait for these guys to understand who's going to succeed or not, and then do a takeover because they still come in relatively cheap. Great approach, in terms of business, but at the same time, it doesn't really help to foster the kind of the building of capacity now, which we need. We need the money today.
Yeah, so it's the wait and see and then acquire approach.
And I think in all walks, there's just a need for sensible, stable policy, is there not? And I think we're very keen to see the mandates and the frameworks that are coming together, that the government delivers on what it says it's going to do, because there is actually a very sensible, cost-effective transition that can be had here, and we want to be a part of that. So I guess in directly answering the question, I suppose I'd probably say I hope so, because I just think a wait and see, and I hope that these sort of frameworks and mandates slacken and loosen and drift. I think that's exactly what we wouldn't want to see, and we'd want governments really to be stiff, firm, and hold their reserve.
And just Roberto, I think, on the panel this morning said the European Commission has been pretty clear again and again and again. The SAF mandate is not going away. But yeah, what do you think, Lorenzo? Is that a view shared by the oil and gas industry?
Well, for the moment, we don't see a direct challenge to the SAF mandate, but of course, oil majors are in a position of incumbents in this moment, and they enjoy also a position of market dominance in infrastructure of jet fuel, and probably this gives them a confidence that they will be anyway the gatekeepers of the markets. So if governments also started to challenge this position of gatekeepers, opening up the market of the infrastructure of jet fuel also to other actors, there will be also much more pressure on oil majors to actually deliver, because then their market dominance might be jeopardized if they don't, if they just choose to not deliver and to share dividends instead of investing.
Great. We get the questions back up on the Slido. And I also do really invite anyone in the room who would like to make a comment, maybe you're an investor or lender, about how you view this, where you see the risk. It'll be really interesting to hear from you, or come approach us at lunchtime. Okay, we'll take this question. How can oil and gas companies get the environmentalists alongside and agree on actions whilst not naming it greenwashing? So I think that's, what type of actions would they have to do to get the environmentalists on side and it wouldn't be named greenwashing?
I guess it's a credible transition plan that we discussed earlier, right? I mean, putting all cards on the table, substantiating the risks, understand where they are in the value chain. If there's a credible discussion and openness, I think environmentalists, I mean, there's extreme ones, but say the average one is open to listen to the story. But I mean, as long as we keep hiding the facts or not acknowledging the facts, then you can imagine that environmentalists are not very upbeat about sitting down, right?
I come back to the point I was making before about transparency. I think the key word in responding to this question is trust, isn't it? And trust starts with transparency. So if we're all clear what the risks and opportunities are that we're carrying, then we can have an informed discussion on the basis of interpreting the facts, but we're not actually, disagreeing about the base evidence.
So transparency and seeing that forward plan.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a question to my panelists and also to the audience? So imagine if all airlines around the world agreed to, taking off a certain amount of SAF, increasing over time, right? I mean, the ICAO has a long-term aspirational goal because there was no commitment to really, kind of tie it down to a very concrete number. So ambition is a great thing, but it can always deviate from that. And I'm just wondering, wouldn't we as an industry do ourselves a lot of good if we just committed to owning the problem, saying, we need a solution, SAF and direct air capture will be a solution to drive this forward, and commit to it? Again, just a question. Would it help?
I mean, yeah, of course it would help. I think aviation as an industry is known to be resilient, is known to be able to reinvent itself again and again and again. Why would this problem be any different than any other problem aviation's faced in the past? At the end of the day, we've shown that we can create solutions to problems people think were unsolvable. Flying, for a starter, I mean, I'm a physicist, I can tell you flying for a starter is solving a problem that people thought was not solvable for hundreds of years. Why shouldn't we agree that we can do this? Because we can.
We sure can. Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. That writing is too small for me to read. Do you want to read it out, Dana?
I think, I will compare this on a compliance versus non-compliance. I think if we comply, the increase in price will obviously come forward, but is not going to be as detrimental to the industry as non-compliance. So I think from an aviation industry point of view, it's better for us if we do comply. But yes, air travel will become more expensive. And I think that as we face these issues of fuel becoming more expensive, we will come with new solutions of making sure we are more efficient with that fuel. And we can use that fuel in a better way to decrease that price again. So going back to the resilience of aviation, when we're faced with problems, we find creative solutions to them. But we need to first solve the biggest problem, which is emissions. And when we solve that, we will look at the next problem, which is efficiency.
Exactly. And I guess as a starter, just going back, I mean, putting out that message, flying will become so much more, expensive. I mean, we're starting with very low amounts of stuff being introduced into the system. So don't tell anyone it's going to be overly expensive. It will evolve over time, but I do agree, we've invented ourselves so many times over and over again. Let's cross that bridge when we come to it. And now, I wouldn't say play down, but just play the facts and say it's not going to increase in the coming years. It's not going to become overly expensive, and it won't deter too many people from flying, I guess.
So just to put a number of what you just said, so just to put that into context, today for the 2% mandate, the increase in price in jet fuel is 27 euros. 27 euros per ton is the increase, is the incorporation of the mandate and incorporating SAF at the EASA's prices, incorporating SAF into the mix. 27 euros per ton. This is it.
I suppose the point I was making previously is there is a sensible, credible pathway to net zero 2050 for aviation, and it comes with a transition cost. But aviation's not alone. All industries come with a transition cost, and it's a perfectly manageable cost, and the scale is such that we can integrate it, and we're innovative, and we'll continue to thrive and be very successful. But the first steps in that is to start that pathway as soon as possible and to making a managed, sensible transition from where we are, which is why we really need to stimulate this SAF production. Relatively small volumes now, but really we need to scale hugely over time.
Thanks, Neil. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for. So maybe just return to the opening question. Is the oil and gas industry keeping net zero aviation on the tarmac? I think the panel have answered that pretty comprehensively. But this isn't a game of pointing fingers. We haven't got time for that. This is way too serious. The oil and gas industry is obviously integral in making this transition work for all of the reasons the panel have gone into. So I think it's over to the investors in the room, the lenders in the room, to have a think about the types of risks that have been highlighted, but also the tools that you have in your toolbox to engage this industry along with us, along with the rest of the business value chain, along with the airports and the airlines, to make this transition go faster, because it's a safe bet that this is going to be a carbon-constrained world. And what, at the moment, we need to make a safe bet is that European aviation is competitive and thriving and has reduced emissions by 2050. Thanks.